next session is What is the World You Want? A digital storytelling project with the University of Oxford. Climate change is the biggest story of our generation, but what kind of story is it? Disaster movie, heroic victory, or good over evil?
In this session, Bill Finnegan, a PhD student from the School of Geography and the Environment, will be looking at the power of storytelling when it comes to fighting the climate crisis, and how a series of digital storytelling workshops in Oxford are empowering young people to share their hopeful visions of a climate resilient future.
But I started laughing.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And as I get my screen sharing set up, I just want to thank everyone who's been involved in making this climate summit possible, Global Action Plan, and also all of the volunteers, the teachers, the learners, the presenters. It's been a great week, and we're very excited to be here to kind of kick off this 5th day looking at sustainable futures. So let me just get my slides on. There we go. And so just to start off with an introduction, my name is Bill Finnegan. I am a doctoral student at the University of Oxford. I'm looking at how secondary schools in the UK are responding to the climate crisis. And I also have a background in documentary film and digital communications with environmental groups, and have been involved in a number of participatory videos over the years, so working with young people to make videos about the environment. And also, I'm very happy that we have Olivia here as well, who was one of the participants in our workshop this summer. So I'll pass it over to you to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name's Olivia. I'm a biology student at the University of Sheffield, hoping to work towards a degree in wildlife conservation. So it's very exciting to be able to be part of these webinars. I've lived in the UK for about 4 years, and I moved from Oaxaca, which is in Mexico, and it's a really beautiful, very biodiverse place. So I've always been very interested in things that are to take care of the planet, basically, and these sorts of projects are really exciting. Like the project that I took part in with William was really exciting, and yeah.
And great, and I'm so glad that you're able to join, and kind of the two of us will be sharing different things about this project and just kind of thoughts about the future as well. One other thing, it's been mentioned a lot in the summit, but if you have any questions, you can always be asking us things. If you're on the live stream page on Transform Our World, there's the box where you can be asking, there's Q&A, and there's also a poll we'll be using about halfway through, but you can also go straight to Slido and enter in that hashtag. And we'll ask questions as they come up. We probably won't get to them towards the end, until towards the end of the presentation, but we'll definitely make time for them. And so you're probably wondering what we're talking about. What does digital storytelling about climate futures really mean? And the easiest way to explain it is actually to show you an example of it. So we're going to share a video that came out of this summer workshop we did. And yeah, I'll just play that, and then we'll talk more about the process and kind of the why of this project afterwards.
Dear Alex,
sorry.
2020 wasn't the best.
I've just realized I don't think I shared my audio, so I'm going to have to quickly stop my screen sharing and restart my screen sharing. So sorry about that. That's one of the things I meant to make sure I did carefully. So quickly stop, and then try that one more time. Sorry, just to make sure, Olivia, can you see the screen again?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Go back.
Dear Alex, 2020 wasn't the best year, was it? However, it gets better. Not instantly, so be patient and keep doing what you can do to help. It took about 5 years on from when you are receiving this when society took their head out of the sand and got to grip with reality. You started to slow down the burning of fossil fuels. You started to drive electric cars. But most of all, you started to appreciate your surroundings. Society opened their eyes. They saw the lush green grass, enchanted with history and beauty. They noticed the slow ripples of the clear blue seawater, stroking our beaches with every wave. They noticed the sheer elegance of Mother Nature. So keep your eyes open and breathe in that fresh, crisp air. Keep the earth in its current state of beauty, and you'll be forever grateful.
So we'll be sharing a few examples of these digital stories over the course of this session, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about why you might want to do a project like this and why explore in particular storytelling when it comes to climate change. So, storytelling is the way for most of human history, especially kind of human prehistory before there was written languages. It's how we communicated, and not just to entertain one another. It's kind of how information about human values and morals and survival were passed from generation to generation. So there's a power to story, and there's a power that really needs to be harnessed when you talk about climate change, because facts and figures can only take you so far when you want to change people. And there's a storyteller who is a fixture in Harvard Square called Brother Blue, who said that stories travel the shortest distance from the heart of the teller to the heart of the listener. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to reach people in their hearts. So why digital storytelling? And in part it's because we live in a digital age. And so if you look out on social media, if you look on Instagram, people are telling stories. They're very carefully curating aspects of their life, crafting a story about themselves. So we've kind of combined this ancient craft of storytelling with the modern tools of information and communication technology. And then the last piece of this question is why climate futures? And for the future, in part, we're kind of following the lead of the young climate activists. The climate strikes were framed around being Fridays for Future, and the youth-driven campaign for education reform in the UK is about teaching the future. So there is this focus on the future that comes naturally from thinking about climate change, but also a lot of climate change education it's kind of looking backwards. It's like, how did we get into the mess we're in, and understanding the science, but also the solutions. But something about shifting your gaze to the future allows you to be creative and imaginative and kind of think of what it will take to make a sustainable future a reality. But another thing to mention is that when you think about the future, often we have two different visions. We either picture a kind of dystopian breakdown, which you find in lots of science fiction and movies, or we picture a green utopia, which is what a lot of people are advocating for and hoping for. But it's worth noting that it's not just an either or situation. There's a lot of space in between these two and a lot of shades of each of them. So there's kind of an unlimited number of futures that are possible. And once you start engaging with these, you can see all the nuance there. Another thing that I think is interesting is the speculative fiction author William Gibson has said, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And often that's, I think, taken to mean the good things of the future, the cool technology. Some people have it and some people don't. But I think you could also flip that and say some of the injustice of the climate crisis is that people right now are suffering in the world. And it's not just some far off thing in the future, it's happening now. And on the flip side of that, there are other people who are experimenting with alternative ways of living right now. So we can find the future even just by looking around to what we see around us. And one last thought before I turn it over to Olivia is that in this project, we kind of pose this question, what's the future you want? But there's also the question that's related is what's the future you think is coming? And sometimes those don't align perfectly. And so I think when starting a project like this, it's really important to create space for people to share both their hopes for the future, but also their fears for the future, and to realize that any future vision is going to include kind of a mix of those two things. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Olivia.
Yeah, so I found this project really interesting because, again, as William said, I find it's a very interesting concept to kind of get people's fears for the future and compare them to what you would want to happen. And obviously, for me, as you'll see in the video, they don't necessarily align. I guess the story that I created is kind of an expression of the fears that I have in terms of climate change. And so, just for some context, we approach the subject through writing letters to our future selves. And I picked roughly 50 years in the future. And we went around Wytham Woods, these really beautiful woods in Oxford, taking pictures to kind of have a visual aid to the video. So yeah, I'll let the video play.
Hey, it's you. Or me. Same thing, except I'm 50 and my reality is very different from what I can remember at 18. I'm hiding in my basement with Layla. Yes, you do remain very close over the years. She's visiting from Oaxaca, or more like living here for the time being. The flooding has been awful there. Her beachside home finally got swallowed into the sea. I know it's really hard to picture. I won't tell you where I live, just to leave you some surprise for your future. Just one piece of advice, though. You may want to rethink your dream home. Trust me, the summers here are unbearable. Believe me, when you get to my present, summer will no longer be your favorite season. I guess I'm just experiencing the consequences of inaction. I know you have trouble sleeping at night. I am you, and not to be pessimistic, but it doesn't get much better. I'm coming to realize that whichever reality you're in, you will always feel like there's a million things you could and should be doing, but it's so easy to spiral, especially when so many surrounding you don't seem to understand how deeply concerned you feel for the state of the world and for your future. You would think we'd all be on the same page, as we are all coexisting on Earth. I'm sorry this letter isn't particularly inspiring, but I don't want to lie about the state of things. Don't get me wrong, a lot of progress has been made, and I think people have definitely started to see the natural world for what it is and all its beauty. It is hard, though, when humans have sprawled so rapidly that you kind of forget what the natural world was in the first place. I'll leave you there, but keep your eyes open. Take care.
Olivia, did you want to say anything else
Yeah.
after watching it?
So obviously you can see it takes quite a gloomy, more pessimistic approach in comparison to the previous video. And it's quite like, even watching it now, I find it quite unsettling, especially hearing my own voice and just thinking about, what the future could be like if no one does anything. And it does cause me feelings of like worry and sadness. And I'm sure some of you viewing that also felt the same way. But I think what this illustrates is that it's really important to have a balance. So it's kind of like, I feel like the previous video was obviously a more optimistic tone. This one's kind of polar opposite. But it's so important to have a balance between both, because if you have excess hope or too much gloom and doom, then it puts people off, it disengages people, and it kind of makes you feel like you can't do anything, or like everything's being done already. So I think it's something very important to address, because it's very difficult to communicate about climate change without obviously causing a lot of fear in people, because it's a very scary thing, and obviously it's so widespread. You kind of sometimes get the feeling like you're not doing enough or you could do more. So I think it's always important to have that bit of hope that keeps everyone motivated. Yeah.
That's great. And yeah, thanks again for sharing the story. And I think hope is a theme we'll come back to later in the presentation, because it's kind of creating that space for hope while also engaging with the reality of the issue, which is, I think, a real challenge for educators, but one that we have to tackle. So to look a little bit at the process, kind of the how of digital storytelling and climate futures. I wanted to share, what created that video. I've also done another workshop, and so this is in case you want to do this in your own classroom, if you're interested in doing this kind of project, kind of the nuts and bolts of it. So the first thing is the locations. So as Olivia said, we're at Whiteham Woods for the summer, where those 2 videos that we've already seen were captured. And that was a 1-day workshop in the summer where there was a larger event going on related to science communication. So there were a number of small teams of people working on different types of videos. And so we had this particular thing on a letter from the future. And the visuals, as Olivia mentioned, kind of came from just walking around taking photos in these woods, the kind of research forest that's on the edge of Oxford. And so those visuals of the forest itself, but also of some of the kind of rundown buildings, became kind of part of the story and kind of visually supported the script. But it's also just interesting. It's just a handful of photographs in each case, but it really, I think, takes you into the scene, into the narrative that the picture they're painting. For the second workshop, we were able to do another kind of small trial run of this at the Oxford University Museum of Natural History. And that was over October half term, and we expanded it to 2 days to have a bit more time to dig into some of the production and editing side of it. But also we took advantage of the fact that we were in the museum, we were able to engage with the building and the collections. We had a very small group, we could do it kind of socially distanced, and it was again, well, before the second lockdown came in. We're planning on trying to do more of these workshops at the Natural History Museum in maybe Christmas holiday and February half term, if we're able to. So if you're in the Oxford area, please look out on the museum's social media or get in touch with me if you'd like to participate. And I'm also kind of exploring other partnerships as well. So the next piece about the how is really the process and the model. And in this case, we're using a model that comes out of the Story Center, which is based in California. And for the past 3 decades, they've been doing story work and kind of created this specific definition of what is digital storytelling. So you might actually think it could mean lots of different things, digital storytelling, because we're immersed in digital media and there's lots of stories out there. But for them, it's something very specific. It's this facilitated process that happens over a workshop, 2 to 3 days long, where people are encouraged to share an important story to them. And so it's very much a reflective process, looking back on some moment in your life where something important happened, and then turning that into a narration in the video. So scripting it out, recording it, and it being very much a first person thing. And then because of the limitations of that time, it's a couple of days, and often people come with very few kind of media skills, they tend to be relatively simple. So often it's just a series of photographs like we've seen, maybe some video, but pretty minimal in terms of the kind of production. But that combination of voice and visual and music and sounds still being a very powerful and helping people, again, share these stories that maybe they've been holding on to. And maybe not shared very widely. It's also sometimes used in very specific settings. So there's a group that has a program in the UK called Patient Voices, and they do digital storytelling with NHS trusts, where they'll bring together healthcare professionals and people who've been navigating the healthcare system to share their personal stories. And that's a system which can often be very kind of impersonal, and they kind of bring in that human dimension. And then another piece of the Story Center is the process model. So there's they have 7 steps of digital storytelling. I abridged one of the steps slightly. So it's, again, there's that initial part where you're reflecting on your story and thinking about the insights and emotions, and then you write it down in the second step. And again, you're focusing on a moment. The twist we did in this workshop was that instead of looking backwards, you're looking forwards. So you're using your imagination to project into the future, but the best stories come not just from kind of doing a laundry list of what you think might happen in the future, but more putting yourself into that scene and thinking about your relationships and what the world is like. Then after you've written it down, you start to see it. So you start to think, what are the visuals that can help tell this story? And those might be your own photos that you've taken over the years that you have on your phone, or they might be going out and taking some pictures wherever you are. Or it could be using particular imagery that you can find online. There's copyright issues there, so you have to be careful about that. And then in the software we use, you also have access to some stock video and stock photos. So that can also be a way to bring the visual layer in. And then the hearing your story is it's that voice again, that kind of how you record it, how you deliver it. So actually, if anyone's interested in kind of public speaking or dramatic speaking, this can be actually an interesting process to go through. But then also thinking about how the music supports it and how you might use sound effects even to kind of focus the viewer on certain things. And then you assemble it, you edit it together using software, and that itself is a bit of a media literacy piece of kind of building up those skills. And then finally you share it. And sharing is a very important part of the Story Centers model, where you actually have these story circles. You come together to share at various points in the process to share kind of what you think your story might be, and then an initial draft of your story, and then your final story at the end. So I'm going to talk about a few of the other things that came out of this process, and kind of, again, things you can incorporate if you're thinking in a classroom setting. So it's a great opportunity for media literacy. And there is even another session this week about media literacy, which goes into it a bit more depth. But if you're worried about misinformation, disinformation, when you create media, when you produce a video, it really impacts how you consume it, because you understand how it's made and you've kind of looked under the hood and behind the curtain. And so you can see the tools that filmmakers use to craft a story, but also to manipulate how you feel about the story. So we, as an example, watched a clip from Planet Earth 2. There's a scene in the Galapagos, iguanas versus snakes. If you haven't seen it, you should Google it, because it's actually an amazing scene, kind of a masterclass in natural history filmmaking. But what we do is we dissect it and we talk about what are the characters, who's the protagonist, the antagonist, what's the crisis, what's the resolution of the crisis, and how is drama and suspense created through music, through pacing, through sound effects. And it's worth noting that filmmakers really create a reality. The reality experienced by these wildlife filmmakers was very different. I mean, they capture if they're honest, they capture animal behavior, but we treat it as a scene where there's one single iguana running away from a bunch of snakes, and they've constructed that. It might have been filmed over a series of days in a number of locations, but they turn it into a reality that's just one scene. So when you create media, you become, I think, a more critical consumer of media, which is really important these days. Another thing we dig into is climate change. We don't spend a lot of time on it in the workshop, but we want to make sure that there's a baseline of shared knowledge. And in particular, looking at kind of visuals of climate change. So I've got the climate stripes as my background on this. We also look at the climate spiral, the Keeling curve, how data is communicated, but also that kind of shows our kind of shared understanding of the state of climate change. There's another issue to this too, which is also thinking about how you communicate with others around climate change. And that could be, again, it could be in a classroom, it could be with your friends, it could be with family members. It could be if you're interested in journalism. So if you're involved in the Young Reporters for the Environment program, how can you effectively write an article about around climate change that actually connects with people maybe in a different way. And so two resources that I'll share here. There's a group in Oxford called Climate Outreach, and they have a website, climatevisuals.org, which is a database of photographs related to climate change, but covering lots of different themes. And it's all based on their research that they've done on which photos really move people and engage people, and are beyond kind of the usual suspects of maybe just seeing a polar bear or a kind of cracked earth in a desert. So that's a great resource. And then another thing that came out recently by Frameworks Institute and On-Road Media is kind of synthesizing other sources of information around climate stories that work, and they come up with a series of recommendations, and there's also a video associated with that. So there are great resources out there if you're interested in how you communicate about climate change. And for these workshops, I'm also thinking about adapting it to also look at the future of biodiversity. And in that case, some of this material would change. It'd be more around how you communicate around biodiversity loss, but also opportunities around rewilding, nature-based solutions, and biophilic design. So the next piece of this is the actual editing. And so we use a program called WeVideo, which is browser-based editing software. It was recommended by the Story Center, and it's been working really well. So again, if you're an educator and you're interested in doing media in your classroom, it's licensed, but the fee per student is relatively low versus if you had to buy software and install it on a series of computers. It can work across different devices because it's browser-based. So this is where you really kind of get into the process of figuring out how you're going to tell your story with sound and visuals. And we actually have some warm-up exercises. So at the museum, we had there's a poem that was written by the poet in residence at the Field Museum in Chicago, Eric Alstein, called Such Frozen Zoos. And so we listened to the poem, and then the participants went around the museum and took photographs related to the poem. And then they went back to their laptops and layered in these visuals with the poem and some music as a chance just to get comfortable with the editing software, but also to kind of engage with the space we were in. And I think that was kind of a nice piece of the process before we dug into their personal story. And so that was that kind of first day, all of the learning about climate change, storytelling, and then that project. And the second day in this workshop over October half term was really focused on this letter from the future. And it's the process that Olivia described. And it starts with writing, kind of just finding a quiet place, getting some words down on paper, sharing an early draft, and then working some more on it, and then moving to recording the voiceover, and then you kind of just spend the rest of the time figuring out how you're gonna bring visuals and turn it into a standalone video. So I've got some screen grabs here, a bit of the script from one video, and then I'm going to show a second video in just a second. But something I liked about this was the visuals. You can see how you use visual metaphors, especially when you're thinking about the future. So this visual of life kind of growing up through the cracks, I think was an interesting one that came out of one of the video projects. And also in the script, you can see this combination of the kind of positive and negative view of the future. There is in one sentence both this idea of repetitive, intensifying cycles of floods and heat waves, but then also ever strengthening communities getting stronger. So I think there's something that we can't just focus on the negative. We can't just focus on the positive. We have to somehow engage with both of these at the same time. And I think this next video example is also a great example of that.
It's 2050, and I don't mind where I live, but the world feels cold. Places don't hold the same unique cultural identities. Everything is shifting all the time due to the huge migration movements from drought and flood-ridden countries. These have eased in the last 10 years, though. No doubt there will be more, but I think things are improving. You don't have children, but most of your friends and their children have voted for Green Party, who have introduced more renewable energy methods and made them more readily available to people through a new scheme they have put in place. However, their place in government remains unsure. The community you live in is small, but we all do little things for the good of the earth. People are more conscious when it comes to sustainability, and we've all had to accept those who care less about this. There will always be people who care less. It's 20.
So that video also used that stock footage that's in WeVideo to kind of create the story, again, using somewhat abstract images, but to paint that picture of the future. So we're just going to take a moment now just to put the question to anyone who's joining us live. How do you feel about the future? And we do have a poll in Slido, and I think that might be something we can also share on screen, the word cloud. So if you're on the live stream page, and also if you're on Slido itself, go to the poll and just type in however you feel about climate change, about the future. And as people do that, I'll describe how we did something like this in the workshop. So at the museum, they had done a previous program called Let's Talk About Climate, and it was aimed at teenagers as well. And they would come in over a series of Saturdays to talk about different aspects of the climate crisis. And kind of as an icebreaker, they had created these cards that had different words on them. And I think we pre-baked the word cloud with the words that was used in Let's Talk About Climate. And you can see just from this photograph that they're color coded. So there's kind of orange, reddish ones that are fairly negative. There were blue ones, which were fairly positive, and then there were green ones, which were a bit more neutral. And as for the icebreaker, you were to grab like 3 cards and then go look for someone who had very similar cards to you and talk about it, and then go find someone else who had very different cards from you and talk about it. And so in the workshop, we did the same process where we grabbed cards, we talked about them, and we tried to arrange them just to kind of see what how people were feeling and how were the group of us feeling. And sometimes it was even the same person had cards that might seem contradictory because it's such a complex issue. We engage with it with complex emotions. Because I'm screen sharing, I can't actually see the word cloud. Olivia, is there anything happening on the word cloud?
Can't really. Oh gosh. I might not be on the right.
If you can't see either, that's no problem.
I can't see it. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if it's possible to also have the word cloud results be on screen, but oh, there we go. Okay. So yeah, just to take a moment to look at this. I mean, again, so I think started this with the words we used on the cards, but it's interesting. The ones that other people have put in are the ones that are now getting much bigger. And yeah, there's that combination there. We've got worried and anxious at the same time that we've got inspired and hopeful. And so and more uncovering in it gets a bit more of an interesting shape. So the thing that that I was gonna share, and well, I think we can go back to my slides in a minute. I'm not sure if I have to start that again. But we did that. I had that picture of what happened early on in the workshop. We came back to it towards the end of the workshop after we watched the videos that had been produced. Just again, it was a small group, just two participants in October half term. And after watching their videos and talking about them, we went back to the cards and grabbed a few of them. And they weren't looking at each other at this, but they picked the exact same 3 cards. And I just thought it was kind of interesting that they picked worried, accepting, and curious, which feels like a good place to be. I mean, we should be worried. At some level, acceptance is kind of the opposite of denial, accepting that change is coming, accepting that we're complicit in the problem. Just not denial comes in all sorts of, big and small. And so acceptance is in some ways the opposite. And then curiosity is going to help us and curious about what the future will be. So I think we could probably turn the word cloud off or remove that from the screen. And I'll need to share my screen again. Okay, let me just do that. So again, these are the cards that were picked at the end of that process, which was, is not a research finding because it was such a small sample, but it was striking to me. And I'm curious about how that will happen in future sessions. So just wanted to bring this back to the research I'm doing. So as I mentioned, I'm looking at how secondary schools in England are responding to the climate crisis. This involves looking at kind of what they're doing in their school, the school facilities. So we've heard a lot about zero carbon schools this week, which was a great campaign from Ashton, but also green schools, eco schools. There's other initiatives out there that are helping schools to tackle this. But then there's the question of what's happening in the classroom. So learning in both the curriculum and the hidden curriculum. And then this piece around preparing young people for the future. If you're going to teach the future, what is the future you need to be preparing for, and looking at themes around resilience and adaptation. So the digital storytelling fits into that last bullet, but for the rest of my research, I'm hoping, as soon as I'm able to be able to be connecting with a number of secondary schools, especially in kind of Greater London and the Thames Valley, so Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Berkshire. And I'm looking for schools that are engaging with this in some way, are already trying to figure out what they're doing around climate change and energy use, but maybe are stuck on certain things. And it would be helpful to have a researcher come in and just interview people, different stakeholders, and perhaps also work with a young group, maybe you have an eco club or something, on some sort of media project. Could be similar to this digital storytelling, or it could be something more around kind of just investigating what's happening at the school or what the opportunities are. So please do get in touch if you're interested in being part of this research. I've got my website at the end, which is again is at the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford, or the School of Geography and the Environment. And okay, I'll pause that for a second. Another theme that's emerging in this research that I'm hoping to explore more is that for lots of people, so for your classmates, for your friends, for family members, they might not be as engaged about climate change as you are. So if you're worried, but also hopeful, you're kind of in the thick of it. And other people, when you talk to them about climate change, the reaction might be a bit like this. So it's not a huge priority. It's not to say that they don't realize it's a problem, but it's not their biggest concern. And then I think there's a bit of a trend where as soon as people start to get engaged with climate change, you kind of quickly go from the shrug to the scream. And, both of these reactions are understandable. But it's the speed with which people go from kind of disengaged to despondent, or from, blissfully ignorant to fatalistic, that seems like a real problem, and also a real challenge when it comes to climate change education. And so it comes back to the same idea. There's a lot of space between dystopia and utopia, and there's a lot of space between these two reactions. And that space in between, I think, is where you find hope. And just to make a distinction between optimism, which is that you think everything's going to be okay, versus pessimism, you think everything's going to be not okay. Whereas hope is you think things might be better. You think there's the possibility of a better future. And there's a particular idea around constructive hope that that we all have a hand in shaping the future. Kind of, it's up to us. We can make a better future, a better reality, but it's going to take some work. But that we shouldn't give up yet. So with that, I was going to turn to the Q&A, and I also want to make sure we have a couple minutes at the end for our kind of closing statement, which Olivia will do. So again, because I'm screen sharing, I can go on my phone on Slido, but Olivia, I don't know if you have seen if any questions have come in. Oh, I do see a couple now.
I'm not sure why this isn't loading for me.
So I see one, not all educators have the time, energy, or maybe the skill to take this kind of approach. Yeah, I think the thing that I did over this 2-day workshop is a pretty intensive commitment from the young people who participate, and also, would not be very easy to do in a classroom. However, there are ways, I think, to just bring in a bit of that media literacy and kind of space for thinking about the future. I think even in the little video that played before we started, there was a primary school where clearly they'd been talking to young people about the future, and they were just drawing a picture, it looked like, and then asked to share what was in their picture. And even that was covering a wide range of ideas about the future. Justice issues were being incorporated, as well as environmental issues. And there is if we have time at the end, I was going to show a short video, but we might not. And it's called Imagine for 1 minute. So it's a 1-minute video that's just to get you to think about the future. So that's another thing that would be really easy to incorporate into the classroom setting. And then how do we get teachers excited about getting involved in projects like this? I think, Olivia, you might have ideas about this too, but for me, I think showing that you are excited about it could help teachers get excited, in the sense that if it's going to make it easier for the teacher to get through a subject that's important for the curriculum or important to them, finding some way to get the students in the class really engaged with it, and creatively, and kind of you know, maybe even working in groups, you know, it seems like that's an opportunity rather than a challenge. I think we probably, yeah, so too many competing priorities for teachers, targets, yeah. Anyhow, there is a challenge for teachers, so that's the other thing is thinking about maybe there's other partnerships outside of the classroom, or in different settings. I want to make sure we turn it over back to Olivia for our closing, so I'll pass it back to you for these final slides.
So I think because there's been, you know, so much chaos this year and it's hard to know what to focus on, it kind of almost seems like everything's coming together and it's like too much to handle, and I think it's really important that we keep hold of what we want the world to look like. And obviously the cool thing about this whole future storytelling is that you have that chance and that space to kind of see your goal, and then you know what you're working towards, because all of this can be so abstract. And so I think obviously everyone wants a world where we can all breathe clean air and not be so worried about, you know, a existential threat, and then we can all actually focus on working together and having a more kind of sustainable way of living. But obviously it's hard to do that when there's things like coronavirus and all these things on the news that are obviously very frightening about climate change. So yeah, I think we must all start putting all our actions and all our words into actions, and start really being aware of what we do. And obviously sometimes it's hard to see the direct impacts of your own efforts on the world, and obviously you're not gonna see a direct change immediately, which is why it's difficult. But you know, small things are always important. Small things like what you eat, what you buy, what being a responsible consumer is really important. And obviously just staying hopeful. As William was saying, that hope is really important. And with that hope, we can keep demanding that, you know, governments implement strict sanctions to limit fossil fuels, and also something that isn't on the slide is to push government leaders to also push for climate education in the curriculum. And I think that's really important, especially for teachers, because it's a hard thing to implement individually, and there needs to be a more structured framework. So I think that's something very important as well.
So thank you, everybody. I feel like we've run out of time, but thanks everyone for joining us. And yeah, please think about your own stories for the future and your own vision for the future.